Hi everybody, welcome to our Google Hangout with the Buck Institute for Education. I'm John Larmer, the Editor-in-Chief here at BIE, and our Hangout today is on the topic of Aligned to Standards, one of the gold standard PBL project-based teaching practices. More about that in a second, but first a couple of logistics. As you know, you can ask questions during the Hangout by entering them onto your Google Plus page there, and if we don't get to them during the Hangout, we'll answer them offline later, or perhaps at the very end there'll be time for answering some questions. But please do ask questions. And this Hangout will last about 30 minutes, around 12:30 Pacific time here in California will end. But it will be archived later on the BIE.org website, so you can tell a colleague or tell a friend to check it out later. And I'll be writing a blog about this Hangout also up on our site by next week. So we have some special guests today, two folks from Ohio, and one more might be joining us soon if he's, Todd Wold is in the middle of a visit to one of our school clients right now, supporting teachers there on a coaching visit. He's going to try and join us soon, we hope. But meanwhile, let's hear from our other guests, both in Ohio. Teresa?
Hi, John. Glad to join you today. I'm Teresa Dempsey. I am currently working as the Director of Professional Development at the ESC of Central Ohio. But prior to that, I've been an elementary teacher and worked as a curriculum specialist in science education and have worked at several universities along the way as well. For the past 5 years, our ESC has been very privileged to have a unique partnership with BIE and doing some capacity building with our districts in Central Ohio. So we've been working with BIE over the past 5 years, supporting some of our Central Ohio school districts, and I've just currently become national faculty over the past year.
Right, and we're glad to have you. Thanks, Teresa. And Jean?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm here in Ohio also. I also work for the Educational Service Center in my spare time with Teresa, but I've been an elementary and middle school teacher and an administrator and a K-12 science supervisor, so project-based learning is very near and dear to my heart. And I am so pleased to be able to help Buck Institute for Education facilitate project-based learning professional development. So thank you very much for this opportunity, John.
All right, good to have you, Jean. And Todd, welcome. We're just saying introductions, just who you are and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Todd Wold. I currently reside in Florida. I've been a teacher for about 20 years, an administrator, and a new faculty member with BIE, and primarily work with STEM and CTE schools in middle and high school, but not exclusively.
All right, welcome, Todd, also in Ohio. So, so our topic today then is aligned to standards, and our guests will be doing most of the talking, but let me just introduce this by letting our viewers know this is part of our new gold standard project-based learning model, which we're promoting as a way to ensure high-quality project-based learning, to make sure it's not done poorly and becomes one of those passing fads in education and doesn't stick. We think really it will stick and be a 21st century, a key feature of 21st century education. But the project-based teaching practices, there are 7 of them you can see on this card, and there's also a blog and an article or two on our website about this. And we think these 7 practices are the key things teachers need to do in a project-based environment. And you can see right there near the top is aligned to standards, right after or alongside designing and planning a project. In the center, of course, are the student learning goals, the key knowledge, understandings, and success skills. Knowledge, understanding, success skills are what you find often are what you find in the standards, of course. Success skills is our term for 21st century skills, the 4 C's, lots of terms for that, those kind of skills too. Critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creativity, and that. But let's hear from our guests then. And my first question is, why do you think aligning to standards belongs on the list of project-based teaching practices? Let's go sort of the same order as the introduction, I guess. Teresa, then Jean, then Todd.
Well, I was really excited when Gold Standard came out, and so we have the pinwheel, or the concept of our design elements as well as our teaching practices. And really this concept of being grounded in standards is essential to both of those concepts. But then you see in teaching practices this active awareness of making sure that we are aligning to standards. And this whole idea of PBL done well, I think that this is an absolutely critical part of making sure it is done well. It is deceptively simple, I think, to some in actually thinking, yeah, got the standards, grounded in that, and you're done. But it really is an active process that really keeps you focused on a very rigorous, highly engaging project for students rather than just a pet project that may be perceived as somewhat fluffy. So making sure that we're aligned to those academic standards and priorities are really essential to make sure we're engaged in true rigor.
Jean?
Yeah, and Teresa highlighted some of the major points and everything, and I think that it's part of the teaching practices, because when we're really planning our project-based learning experience, we have to make sure that it is grounded in those standards. So it's really thinking about what do we need to really use to plan our PBL. And so those standards, the state standards, whether you're Common Core or you have individual state standards, it's really going to those documents and really pinpointing those standards that you really want students to master through the processes of the PBL. So just piggybacking on that, it's just so critical to the planning process for PBL, and that's why it's grounded in those teaching practices.
All right, and Todd?
When you first asked this question the other day to us, I was thinking about a quote of, it's not the destination, it's the journey. I like to think of the standards as the journey. I also had a former administrator who did a really good job with us as teachers in asking us, why are you doing this? And if we can't really answer that, then it's not very authentic. It's got to have that real purpose, otherwise it's just fluff.
All right, good point. We can't have PBL be just fluff. Several years ago, when the Buck Institute was first developing its model for essential elements of project-based learning, we were trying to really push back against the perception, the stereotype that PBL was just fluff or fun, but not really a good way to cover content. I should say teach content, not cover it. So we always used standards-focused project-based learning as our way of describing it. It wasn't some of the stereotypes of PBL that people had. All right, so with that kind of warm up to the topic, let's dig in a little deeper. And this question came to me because when I used to facilitate our PBL 101 workshops for teachers, sometimes people would bring their standards documents to the workshop and actually start by looking at their standards, and they were generating ideas for projects. But a lot of teachers, they had them off to the side, but they were generating ideas just in conversation or going online or thinking about their kids, lots of ways to get ideas for projects, and then mapping back onto the standards later. So you facilitate a lot of these workshops for us, and in your own work with teachers, as teachers, what do you think? When designing a project, should a teacher start with the standards, or is it okay to start with other ways and then map back?
That's an interesting question, John, and I get that all the time from teachers in the professional development. And sometimes they're looking for, give me the one right answer. Well, that's the same thing. We're trying to get our kids to think critically about things, then the teachers also need to think critically. So I don't necessarily think there's one right answer to that. It's if you are familiar with your standards, you can ground it easily in your standards, and you might generate some ideas. But I have found some very good starts for project-based learning, for designing a PBL experience, where they start with an issue or a problem, and then they find the standards that would be directly linked. So I don't necessarily think it's where's the starting point. It's that your standards, your products, your assessments, your activities, they all have to be aligned. And so it's really focusing on that alignment And you can start at any one of those points. They should always be aligned to those standards. And so some have started with an idea or an activity or even a product, and then make sure that it is grounded in the standards. And so sometimes I find that easier and start in other places, because sometimes teachers start with the standards and then don't necessarily make strong connections so that students master those standards through the process of doing the PBL. So I'm not sure there's one right answer, but they all have to be aligned with the standards.
Okay, thanks. Teresa, Todd?
I absolutely agree with Jean. I think one of the things, well, I know one of the things that I share with teachers as we work on this, and some of it is absolutely about meeting people where they are and in their comfort level. If we have some that are just starting with a blank slate, I encourage them to be very strategic about how they start. Really think about the standards that are going to give you your biggest return on investment when you think about the elements of PBL, gold standard, in terms of authenticity and sustained inquiry. Which standards are going to lend themselves best to those pieces, to those elements, to make a real high-quality PBL? And I'm sure we all know there are some standards that are better suited to that than others. So that's really, I think, a good point. Sometimes we have teachers that come in and they think they have to use the standards that they're beginning to use for the start of the school year, and that might be the case, that they might be outstanding standards and very well suited to PBL, but sometimes they may not. So I really encourage them to look deeply at what the standards are asking students to do, what level of rigor is being asked, and to think about, is this a good choice for where we need to go in terms of grounding this PBL?
Yeah, I agree with both Jean and Teresa. In what Teresa was just saying, letting the person's kind of PBL journey, where they're at, that does make a huge difference, and the situation needs to be taken into account. For me, I tend to like to take my core content standards and have those drive the project, but I think a lot of that's just because that's the way I learn and the way I think, and it's what works for my situation. For me, it helps me maintain authenticity, it helps me maintain rigor, like Teresa mentioned, and answer that question, why are you doing this project? However, what I find is that once I have a public product in mind, then I tend to backfill support standards that might be outside of my core content area. So I kind of tend to go back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jean, you mentioned some things that lead into my next question. The idea of aligning to standards isn't just something you do at the beginning and say, okay, check off some boxes of which standards your project's going to address, and then you're done. You mentioned aligning the products and the rubrics, your assessment practices, your scaffolding for students. So let's talk a bit more about that. So what is it? And maybe let's get some examples of projects too, like where how a product did align with a standard, and perhaps even maybe some counter examples of when things went awry and a product was not well aligned to a standard, for example. So let's dig into that topic. And anybody want to start, or should we go in the same order?
I can start. I'll take an example that we use often, and it really is the California Propositions Project, which California Propositions Project, which I think is actually available through Buck Institute for Education's website. And in that example, which is a high school example, if I just take one of the standards that they addressed in that, write arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantial topics or texts using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. That is the standard. If you break that standard apart, you really can see the alignment to the project. So in other words, where the project had to do a 30-second video commercial to change a voter's mind, Well, if the standard says write arguments to support claims, I can see the direct alignment to that because to the product that they had to produce. So it wasn't that we were asking to write a research paper, because a research paper would not be a relevant way to do an argument. And so it's really looking at each piece of the design plan for the PBL to see where am I using that language directly from the standard. So it's really breaking apart that standard. So I think the California Propositions Project gives a really good link to standards that people may be familiar with for the upper grades in high school. So in those English language arts standards.
Jean, what you said reminded me of the common practice of unpacking your standards. So is that what you're talking about? And do you guys recommend that? And how might you connect that to PBL, I guess, is my question. I mean, the idea of taking apart your standards, unpacking what actually is required in order to demonstrate mastery of them. Do you have any thoughts about that?
For me, John?
Sure, Jean, and then then I'll move on to Teresa and Todd.
Yeah, I definitely think that it helps because like Teresa said, we're really looking, are we meeting the rigor that is expected of the standards? And sometimes I find when teachers or educators are designing project-based learning plans that they don't really meet the rigor because they're not really looking at the verbs and the nouns in the language of the standards. So I think unpacking the standards will help you to really think about your products and assessment pieces, as well as even that rigor, level of rigor. So I really think, yes, important to really look at those standards and unpack them to really help plan.
Okay, thanks. Teresa?
Yeah, I would just add that I'm sure probably we have some viewers that are fans of Understanding by Design, the work of Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. I actually trained with Authentic Education, Grant Wiggins Group, for several years earlier in my career, and so I'm a huge fan of unpacking the standards and really digging deep into really understanding fully what they're asking. It's really relevant now as we have many educators looking deeply at student growth and really trying to determine whether they are making an impact on student growth. And where that starts is with unpacking your standards and really looking deeply and perhaps doing a pre-assessment, post-assessment that can easily be incorporated into project-based learning. We have examples of what we're calling data teams. Some of people may have experience working in data teams where data teams are grounded in an instructional practice. And that instructional practice starts with looking at the standards, and teachers bring examples of student work samples and products and look deeply at that alignment piece. Was this an example of alignment? Did we see growth? How much growth? And then having that opportunity to reflect upon, I don't know that the product really hit as deeply as we intended with the standard, so maybe we need to go back and do some revisions. So absolutely, it's not exactly the most exciting and tantalizing topic to think about and to work on. It can be mind-numbing to do, but as we think about one of the most precious resources that we all say we don't have enough of, that is time. And so more than ever, we need to make sure that we are aligned to those standards as we do think about that precious commodity to make sure that we're really focused on the right stuff in our classrooms.
All right, here. Yeah, time is the most important thing. You're right. And Todd, your thoughts on what it means to align a project to standards?
Yeah, I want to echo a lot of what was already said, and they've got very experienced and valid there. I'd like to add to that as well, operating a PLC or something to that effect among colleagues. The standards, I guess it's the unpacking as well, but I build in my formative assessments along the way directly to those so that I can ensure through various different benchmarks and reflection pieces and revision pieces, and asking the students, how are you in this piece right here? How are you demonstrating this standard to me? Whether it's balancing chemical equations or the energy efficiency or whatever it is that I'm having to get across. It also helps me choose which rubrics I'm going to be using so that I can directly target those and be very intentional about it and purposeful and transparent from the very beginning of the launching of the project to my students. I guess the last point I wanted to say is I think it also allows me to scaffold, where I can possibly scaffold the process or the product so that I can get to every student in my classroom where they are to give them every ample opportunity to demonstrate their understanding of the content.
Okay. Todd, you mentioned two things I think are good points to expand on a little bit, so let me take those one at a time. One was rubrics, the other was about students, student participation in the idea of aligning to standards. So let's talk about that one first. So what do you think, or what do you recommend then as far as students being involved in aligning to standards? I mean, they should know what the learning targets are for a project. What else can they do, though, in terms of student role in this process?
Is that for me?
Sure, we'll start with you.
Okay. It's a tough question, to be honest with you. So they do one way and sometimes the other way, and head back and reevaluate, hoping it would work. In the end, for my classes, I feel if I'm able to be transparent with the students, I'm also able to be transparent with other players, such as administrators and such. As they're walking in, what is it you're doing, why are you doing it, and giving the students the tools so that if somebody walks into my classroom and asks a student directly, what are you working on today and why are you doing it, they're able to articulate that content vocabulary as it comes directly from the standards, and they know why they are doing what they're doing. And I kind of tend to tell my students, yes, we want the end product to be authentic and real and public, but in the end, that's not really the point of why we're doing what we're doing.
Right. Teresa, Gene, any thoughts about a student's role in aligning to standards? You don't have to say anything, but just in case you do.
Just very briefly, is that I even think at the elementary school level, so elementary through high school, that there is a role for students in that, in aligning to standards, because they have to really, we have to put it in their words. They have to ask the questions they need to ask about what they're learning. So I think it's kind of them thinking, about their thinking. What do I know about this? Where, So we have classes that students' range of abilities and background knowledge is just so wide that I think you have to engage the students in the discussion at some point, or have them think critically about, as Todd said, what they're learning and why they're doing that and how does it connect. So I think that helping them to think about their thinking is very important.
I would add, I absolutely agree with Gene and Todd. I'm thinking of a student-led process where I'm sure those that have been through the most recent PBL 101s through the question formulation technique, where perhaps what you could use is a snippet from the standards where students do see some of that standard language, and then they have the opportunity to create questions about that standard that they would like to learn. So there's also, as something that we really ask teachers to focus on, that could also be something that is driven into a student example, is making sure that your driving question is aligned to your standards as well. So I really love the question formulation technique, and I think that there definitely could be a way that perhaps that your standards language not taking the full standard and perhaps maybe, as Jean suggested, making sure that it's student-friendly language, but presenting the standard in student-friendly language and then encouraging students to use the question formulation technique to create questions of interest to really get into some of the in-depth inquiry.
Mm-hmm. John, Todd brought up a point about scaffolding, which is very important. And I will tell you there's another way that I use standards documents and planning PBL. And that is really thinking about, because many teachers will say, well, my students really, they can't do that yet because they haven't done this and haven't done this. And we find that a lot in science education because maybe in elementary school the teachers didn't spend as much time as they would have on other subjects. And so there might be a gap in their understanding of some of the science content by the time they get to middle school. And so I always encourage educators when they're planning PBLs to really look at the vertical alignment also. Will the PBL help them to be ready for the next step or level? So when you talk about scaffolding instruction, when you're really using the student learning guide, it's really looking at what were the standards before and what are the standards after, and how are we going to make sure I have that rigor there, but also provide the scaffolding for those standards which maybe they've never had any experience with. So I think those standards, even before or after specific grade levels in content, are very helpful in planning scaffolding and using that student learning guide in that way.
Okay, good point. And I want to, Teresa, you mentioned driving question. I'll get back to that in a second. How do you align a driving question to standards? But first, just quickly on the rubrics. Buck Institute has developed some rubrics for the 4 C's: critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, and also for making a presentation, part of communication. And we have rubrics that are aligned to the Common Core standard. We have some non-Common Core versions too. But we actually use actual language from the standard in the rubric. So is that generally what you'd recommend also, and especially for a content rubric? It's not about a 21st century competency, but more of a content-based rubric. Is using the actual language from a standard something you'd recommend?
That's typically what I tend to do.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of prefer a rubric that's got 4 columns myself. I always want the second from the furthest to be that they demonstrated their understanding, and I want one more opportunity for them to go above and beyond. And so to me, that's part of the scaffolding where I can reach my gifted and talented students, give them an opportunity that's going to challenge them to take it to an even deeper level if they can.
Okay.
I absolutely agree with Todd, and I would say too that making sure that it is focused in standards-based language keeps the rubric very objective and very focused on the academic rigor and whether we are seeing growth. That's really what a rubric's purpose is to communicate where we are in our growth of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I will just echo what Todd and Teresa said. I think it's very important, and it's very important when a teacher goes back to look at what is the evidence that they can use that rubric to show that the students have mastered or where their proficiency is in those content standards.
Okay.
And John, can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Jean just mentioned mastered, and I think she's exactly right. One thing I want to make sure that I mention as well is when we're working with folks like CTE, where sometimes their standards are coming out of industry instead of out of academia, and taking those mastery skills that must be demonstrated straight from industry and putting those in there so they know that they've met what they need.
All right. Thanks, folks. Our time is, getting away from it's almost time to close. But our last question then can be fairly quick. I just want to hear your thoughts on some common challenges you've seen teachers face or pitfalls they might run into when trying to align their project-based learning to standards.
One common thing that I see is that it's very difficult for people, especially brand new to designing PBL, is how many standards do I include? How many standards should I plan my PBL around? if it's interdisciplinary, do I end up with a shopping list of standards? So I think it's something that you have to really think about. What amount of time would I spend on this group of standards? And it's really not just brushing across the standards. So in your PBL design, I think that you really have to thoughtfully think about what standards I am covering for the amount of time, the activities, the products, all those pieces. So that does take some planning.
Okay. Teresa, Todd?
Okay, I'll go ahead and piggyback off of Jean. This whole idea of depth versus breadth, I think, is imperative in thinking about standards. I think the other thing that I would piggyback on what Jean had to say is this whole idea that aligning standards is an active process. It's not a passive process. And probably one of the biggest things I see that I would love to just bring an awareness about is that when we begin PBL design, most times we do start with standards, or near the beginning, perhaps even after idea. But then what tends to happen is we forget about them as we get caught up in the design process and creating the product, and maybe even going into rubric design, as you mentioned, John. So what I'm a fan of is redirecting our designers back to those standards through every step of the process and thinking, oh no, I really did start to go down another path here that I thought would be really engaging for students, but it takes away from the intent of what our standards were initially asking for. So that would be my word of caution, is this whole idea that it really needs to be an active process throughout, not just something we think about at the very beginning.
Todd?
I need to echo exactly what they said. Jen and Teresa are exactly right. The only thing I can think of adding, I do like to use the term natural fits. I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking that our project needs to be very linear and sequential, and there are times where it's okay to work on the PBL and then step away from it until you can get to the next piece of the standard that you need to be able to get to that naturally fits to get you to an authentic public product without it being forced.
Okay, I like that idea, Todd, of a natural fit. You're right, it can't be forced. I mentioned driving questions, and we didn't have time to get to it. Let me just say briefly, though, that I've always used this way to assess a driving question's alignment to standards. To answer it, will students need to learn the things you've identified they should learn: knowledge, understanding, success skills. So it's a way to check yourself. The standards words themselves don't have to be in this driving question, but to answer it, are students going to have to learn the standard? That's a check I use. So if you have any final thoughts on that or anything else, I'll get back to you in a second. Let me just tell our viewers that, remind you that this Hangout will be archived at BIE.org, and you can find articles and blogs there also about our gold standard project-based learning model, both the teaching practices and the essential project design elements. Look for a blog on this Hangout appearing next week, and on November 17th we'll be having a Hangout on the topic of a public product, which is one of the essential project design elements. I'll wrap up in a second, but let me just get a last word from each of our guests. So, Todd, how about we start with you this time?
I appreciate the opportunity that you guys put together at BIE to model the very thing that we are asking others to do, and for us to come together and collaborate just like we are right now, and to learn from one another, to be able to go back on this and reflect on this, and now I can go back into my classroom and master my trade even some more. So, John, Jean, Teresa, I appreciate your expertise.
All right, appreciate yours too, Todd. Thanks. And Teresa?
I just want to say ditto. Thank you. This is a really important point to be made about project-based learning, especially as we think about PBL done well, and I think it's often overlooked. So I just want to thank you for really making it a topic of dialogue for us to have in our PBL community.
Right. Thanks, Teresa. And Jean.
And I truly want to thank you also. And I really appreciate participating in a new discussion for the really gold standard teaching practices. And so as we begin to really become familiar with these, I think that it is a great piece for teachers to think about their instructional practices. And I really believe PBL done well is not fluff. And I think aligning to those standards is a key in that. So thank you.
You're welcome, and a great point to end on, Jean. Thanks. All right, folks, so thank you very much for watching today and joining us. We'll see you, I hope, on November 17th, and may all your projects be gold standard, aligned to standards. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Right.